We're in the heat of the college football season. This week will be the first college football playoff poll, where the top four teams will be at least in a privileged position of being able to get to the college football playoff. There'll be a lot of debates in the upcoming week about who those top four teams should be. Of course, we all know who's number one, but that's for another sermon. Roll Tide. I know, Mari gave me the thumbs down, but it's very touchy, by the way. If there's only one thing, I grew up in the South, and there's only one thing in the world I grew up in that was more polarizing than politics, it was college football. That's still today true. I grew up in Alabama, and they say that college football is like a religion, only it's more important. So I lived in that world, and this time of year, when we think about sports, and it happens other times of the year as well, human beings are obsessed with who's number one, who's the best, who's the greatest, what's the most important, and who is the most important. We're going to talk about that today when it comes to the commandments found in the Bible. I want to read to you one verse, really one that Terry read a moment ago, where we read in Mark chapter 12, verse 28, one of the scribes came near and heard them disputing. This is Jesus and some of the Sadducees. Heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that Jesus answered them well, he asked him, which commandment is the first of all? According to a 3rd century Jewish tradition, there are 613 different commandments found in the Bible. Now, I know that has been debated down through the years and still debated among Jewish rabbis today. Also, one of the things that has been debated is that which one of those commandments is most important, and how do you prioritize? When you have 613 commandments or something like that, you have to eventually come down to trying to triangulate as what's the most important, right, of all. That debate was ongoing in Jesus' day. And it was that debate that prompted a scribe, and this is a Jewish religious teacher who perhaps not only was someone who we think of a scribe writing down or copying the scriptures, but also someone who became an expert in the Jewish Torah because they'd spent so much time with it. And those kind of people, just like contemporary theologians today, like to discuss these finer points of how to prioritize the teachings of the scriptures. And so this scribe encountered Jesus just after he was kind of wrapping up a dispute with the Sadducees over the question of the resurrection. And so this scribe, who liked what he had said in response to the Sadducees, because indeed the scribes were more aligned with the Pharisees who believed in the resurrection, whereas the Sadducees did not, he agreed with Jesus on that, so he thought, well, I'm going to ask him a question. And so he asked him which commandment is first of all. And we're going to see today how Jesus answered that question and engaged this religious expert, and how he prioritized one value above all the others. And that is the value of love. Now, he uses love here in a little different way than we often think of it. Often when we think of love, we think of having a deep emotional affection for someone or something, and it certainly includes that. But the way the word love is going to be used today goes beyond simply an emotional affection for someone or something to the idea of a sense of devotion and loyalty. And that's the idea here as Jesus talks about love and how he emphasizes it in his response. So we're going to kind of move through this story and try to apply some things as we go along. First of all, as I mentioned to you, Jesus was engaged in this dispute. He's questioned, and Jesus' response, well, it's a response that you find in 3 of the Gospels, where Jesus says that the most important things, the most important commandments of all, are those that emphasize love, specifically love for God and love for our neighbors as ourselves. And he uses a text that really was a foundational text for the Jewish people. It got a name based on the Hebrew word for hear or to listen and obey, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God is one. And you shall love Yahweh, your God, with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. And so Jesus responds, first of all, by saying it's about having a devotional love and loyalty to God above all others. And remember, they lived in a world where there were multiple choice options for deities. As we talked about last week, Jesus spoke these words in a world where the Greeks and the Romans had whole pantheons of deities, and so there were multiple options. But Jesus is saying, no, the greatest commandment is to love Yahweh, the God of Israel, above all others and above all things with complete and total devotion. And then he adds something else. And the second most important commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. And in that he quotes also an Old Testament text found in Leviticus chapter 19. And you see, I gave it for you there, 19 verses 17 and 18. So Jesus prioritized love for God, a devotional love for God, and an ethical love for our neighbor as ourselves as the most important values, not only of his kingdom, but the most important commandments in the whole of the Hebrew Scriptures. In Matthew's version of Jesus' encounter with a scribe on this subject, Jesus said, on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. That is the entirety of the Hebrew, the Jewish Scriptures. You can hang them on the principles of a devotional love for God and an ethical love for others. As a matter of fact, I've told you on many different occasions, really that's the interpretive grid through which I read the Bible. Anything I find in the Bible that is consistent with love for God and love for my neighbor as myself, I try to embrace. Anything I find in the Bible that is incompatible with love for God by loving my neighbor as myself, I set that aside, because there are examples in the Bible where people did not love their neighbors as themselves. One of the problems, for example, with the ancient Hebrew people is when they read Leviticus chapter 19 verses 17 and 18, it specifically says the love for their neighbor as themselves only extended as far as, do you anybody know who it would be? Their fellow Israelites. And it says that right there in the text. You can go back and read Leviticus chapter 19, verses 17 and 18. It's talking about your kin, your members of your family, the members of your tribe, the members of the Israelite community. You're to love them as yourself. That did not extend consistently to other people outside their ethnic group and their national identity. You remember in Luke's version of this same encounter, Jesus answers the question, the second question that the scribe answers, because the scribe says, well, who is my neighbor? And he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, where there is an example of a Samaritan caring for a Jewish man who had been attacked on the roadside between Jericho and Jerusalem. So Jesus begins to expand the idea that love for your neighbor it doesn't just include your own people, your own group, your own family, your own clan, your own tribe. It begins to have a global perspective. And thankfully, in part because of the Enlightenment, even Christianity is beginning to think more and more in terms of the total expanse of who my neighbor is all members of the human family. And in time, I think we'll go beyond that. So we'll think more about how our actions affect the flourishing of all sentient life on the planet. That is, any animal life as well that has the capacity to suffer, I think will increasingly expand our ethical concern to include them, and we already are doing that. But see what Jesus did here? He summarizes his teaching, he summarizes his kingdom, his message with the principles of love for God, a devotional love for God that is directly connected to an ethical love for our neighbors as we would love ourselves. And he links the two. And the way he says it, they're inseparable. As a matter of fact, the most important way we love God is by loving the fellow members of our human family. No matter who they are, no matter where they're born, no matter what their color is, their ethnicity, their gender, etc. The love is all expansive. And so that's how this story goes. Well, the Jewish scribe agrees with Jesus. He says, you're right. I agree with you the first time about the resurrection. I agree with you on this one as well. He agrees that a devotional love for God and an ethical love for neighbor is even more important than even the offerings and sacrifices commanded in the Torah. And that's saying a lot. You see an evolving type of Judaism already here, and Jesus is also wanting his followers to embrace this idea. As important as to the Jews as the ancient sacrificial system and all the rules and rituals associated with the observance of the cultic aspects of their faith. Even this scribe acknowledges, Jesus, you're correct. This principle of love for God and love for neighbor is more important than all the religious exercises that you can engage in. Now, Christianity didn't always embody that, as you know. Still to this day, we humans struggle with thinking just because we perform certain religious activities, or we go through some ritual, or some worship experience, or we have some sort of emotional engagement in a group setting like a church or another event, that alone is sufficient to make one a good Christian. No, the real test is how you treat your neighbor. The real test is how you treat the person who is different than you are. That's the real challenge. And do you think we don't struggle with that today? We still make distinctions, right? We still do. We love our neighbor as ourselves, but we want to limit who that neighbor is and the circumstances under which we do so. But Jesus and this scribe both agree, and that's why the author of Mark's gospel includes it in his gospel, is to show that there is consistency between what Jesus taught and the core of Jewish belief and Judaism at that time, that there's a consistency between the two, and that was intended to show how Jesus is connected all the way back to Moses and the law and the Torah, and that Jesus embodied the true intentions of the Torah and the true intentions of God, what God intended all along through his message and his mission. So what does this mean for us today? How does Jesus respond to the scribe? He says to him that he was not far. You are not far from the kingdom of God. You know, that was Jesus' message. Jesus came announcing that the kingdom of God was near. And what he's saying here is at the core of what the kingdom of God is all about is expanding the sphere of people, the number of people and the sphere of influence of those people who are committed to loving God and loving their neighbor as themselves. Or you might say loving God by loving our neighbor as ourselves, because you can't really separate the two. And what this means for us today as we think about these great commandments, or the great commandment, the commandment to love, a devotional love for God, and how we cultivate that, and a devotional love, an ethical love for our fellow neighbors, it really involves this ongoing deepening of empathy we have for others. I think empathy is one of the most pro-social values that we can teach ourselves and our children. The idea of loving your neighbor as yourself by treating others the way you wish to be treated involves this sense of, interchangeability of perspectives. Have you ever heard that before? Interchangeability of perspectives is the ability to empathize with another person and identify with how they feel and how the world is impacting them. It's the old saying that before you judge someone, walk a mile in their shoes, so that after you've judged them, you'll have their shoes and be a mile away. No, that's not the reason. It's you're trying to identify with what they're going through. You're trying to put yourself in their perspective. And we all need to continually learn this, right? We all need to cultivate this because there's a lot of tension in our world. If we cultivated more empathy and more of the ability to have an interchangeable perspective with other people that we disagree with, it might help us further this ongoing challenge that we have between different races. If we could focus more on interchangeability of perspective and cultivating empathy between white folks and black folks, we might better understand one another's world, and we might be able to work together to try to bring greater reconciliation that has been a constant thorn in our side throughout American history, going all the way back to the slave trade and slavery and segregation and the animosity that white majorities had toward minorities, especially people of African descent. Interchangeability of perspective is trying to put ourselves in the, if you will, in the skin of other people who are different from us and experience things from perspectives that we've never experienced ourselves. This is true with other tribes that we're not a part of. It's true about the differences between the sexes and the genders and the way we think about this, whether it's the issue of sexual orientation or it's an issue of gender identity. Being able to stop for a moment and at least try to empathize and have an interchangeably perspective and imagining ourselves in a situation and wondering how we would wish to be treated if we were in that same situation. We don't have to agree or understand everything to be able to empathize with other people. And it's not just things that are about intrinsic to who we are, it's our belief systems. Is it possible for Republicans and Democrats in America to cultivate interchangeability of perspective? We're not going to agree. There's some things that Republicans and Democrats are never going to agree on. That's just the nature of politics. And there's a lot of things that we're just not going to be able to hug out. Okay? It's just true. Somebody's going to win. The question is, who's it going to be? But in the process, will we lose that which we have in common because we can't cultivate any type of empathy and interchangeability perspective with people who differ with us politically? What about on nation states? Is it possible for a middle class, upper middle class white American to identify with what it would be like to have been born in Honduras? In a country that is horribly and terribly violent, where many people are trying to flee it? Is it possible to cultivate interchangeability of perspective? That doesn't solve all the questions of immigration and all that. It doesn't solve it, but it must start with the ability to at least say, what if I had been there? You know, you didn't pick your parents and you did not pick the place of your birth. I didn't. I doubly didn't pick my parents. I was adopted. It's true. I failed twice to pick my parents. I didn't pick the color of my skin. I didn't pick my gender. I didn't pick any of this stuff. So part of learning to love your neighbor as yourself is to say, let me put myself in their perspective. Or let me try. Let me learn enough about other people, other cultures, other races, genders, etc., to at least be able to say, I've tried to think about how that person or those people may feel, to the point that it can help me soften some of the harsher and harder edges that we have toward one another. I was interviewed for that article. It was in the paper about 2.5 months ago. A lot of stuff's happened in the last 2.5 months. Matter of fact, the guy called me back and he said, and I told him, I said, you know, you interviewed me about 2.5 months ago, and I don't remember what all I said to you. And I hope that nothing I said then didn't cover some of the things that's happened since, and people think I'm talking about some of the things that's happened since. But my central point in the article is, look, in this congregation, we have Democrats, we have Republicans, we may have a Green, we may have a Libertarian, I don't know, I haven't never taken a poll. We have some independents, we have people who don't identify at all with any kind of political party anyway, and I'm supposed to pastor every one of you. Now, I have personal and private political views. I have some things I think are more important than others. Some you may agree with me, some you may not. But you know the most important thing I'd like to see? I'd like to see people be able to sit down and civilly discuss them. Be passionate about it, think they're important, talk about it, but a part of discussing is having the ability to sit on one side of the table and the other side of the table, and then imagine yourself on opposite sides of the table and how you'd carry on that conversation if you just happen to find yourself on the opposite sides of that table. one of the greatest challenges we face in our world, in a world of social media and 24/7 television, is the ability to calm down a little bit and take a deep breath and engage our minds and talk to one another and try to find points of agreement. And when we can't, to at least decide we're going to try to fight fair. Now, I know in politics there's no such thing as a fair fight. If you watch the political videos, they ain't trying to be fair, okay? That's not the way it works. They're trying to win. But if all of us do that, it's going to be a war of all against all. I don't think it's going to turn out well. So I hope you think about these things, and I hope you remember the words of Jesus as we follow him and as we try to promote his kingdom, that when we go out into the presence of Christ in our world, that we cultivate a love for our neighbor as ourselves, interchangeability of perspective, and being able to walk a mile in people's shoes before we judge them. And I think when we do that, we'll be focusing on the things that Jesus thought was first of all.